John Carter sat at the scarred oak table in his modest apartment in Columbus, Ohio, his calloused hands gripping a letter that felt like a betrayal etched in cold ink. The paper, stamped with the sterile logo of First National Bank, demanded payment for a $25,000 loan he had no memory of taking. John, a 42-year-old mechanic who spent his days elbow-deep in engines at Harper's Auto Shop, lived by a simple code: work hard, pay your way, stay out of debt. Debt was a trap he'd seen swallow too many people. Friends who bought houses they couldn't afford, neighbors who juggled credit cards until they buckled under the weight. John had sworn he'd never fall into that pit. He lived frugally, saving what he could for a dream he rarely spoke of: a small cabin in the Hocking Hills where he could fish in a quiet stream and watch the stars without the city's glow drowning them out. Yet here was this letter, official and unyielding, claiming he owed money for a loan he'd never seen, never signed for, never wanted. He read the words again, each one a sharp jab to his gut. Failure to make payments will result in further action, including potential legal consequences, the letter warned in stark black print. John's jaw tightened, a familiar ache creeping into his shoulders, the kind that came from long hours under a car or carrying burdens he didn't ask for. He tossed the letter onto the table where it landed beside a chipped coffee mug and a stack of unopened utility bills. The apartment was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional honk from the street below. It was a Thursday evening in early fall, the air outside crisp with the promise of October. John had just come home from a 10-hour shift, his clothes still carrying the faint tang of grease and metal, his hands rough from years of turning wrenches. Those hands felt unsteady now, as he ran them through his thinning brown hair, the letter's words echoing in his mind. This wasn't a clerical error. It felt personal, like a knife slipped between his ribs by someone he trusted, someone close. John's thoughts turned to his sister Emily. At 39, she was 3 years younger but carried herself with a charisma he'd always envied. Emily lived across town, in Worthington, a tidy suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. She shared a 2-story colonial with her husband, Greg, a mid-level manager at an insurance firm, and their 2 kids, Lily, 10, and Max, 7. Emily was the charming one, the one who could talk her way out of a parking ticket or make a stranger feel like an old friend with a single smile. Growing up in a cramped house on the east side of Columbus, they'd been inseparable. They'd shared secrets by the creek behind their house, covered for each other when their parents' rules felt too heavy, and laughed through late-night comic book sessions under the covers with a flashlight. John was the steady one, fixing broken bikes, smoothing over fights, even repairing their mother's old radio when it sputtered out. Emily was the dreamer, always chasing something bigger, a better job, a nicer house, a life that sparkled like the one she saw on TV. But lately, she'd been distant. Calls went unanswered, plans to grab a coffee or catch up over burgers fell through, with excuses about soccer practice, school events, or work deadlines. John had chalked it up to her busy life, kids, a mortgage, a husband who traveled for work, but now, staring at the letter, a cold suspicion began to take root. He grabbed his phone, his thumb hovering over Emily's name in his contacts before pressing call. The line rang 4 times, each ring stretching the silence in his apartment like a taut wire. Finally, Emily picked up. "Hey, Johnny." Her voice was bright, but there was a strain in it, like she was pasting on a smile for an audience she didn't want to perform for. "Long time no talk. What's up? Everything okay?" I got a letter from the bank," John said, keeping his voice even despite the anger simmering beneath. A slow burn that threatened to flare. "Says I owe them 25 grand for a loan. You know anything about this?" There was a pause, long enough to make his stomach twist. A silence that felt heavier than the letter in front of him. "What? No, of course not," Emily said, her laugh high and brittle, the same laugh she'd used when they were kids, and she'd borrowed their dad's pocket knife, only to lose it in the backyard. That's ridiculous, John. Must be a mix-up. Banks screw up all the time, you know? I got a weird letter once about a credit card I didn't have. Turned out to be some glitch. John wasn't buying it. Her laugh was a tell, one he'd known since they were kids, sneaking cookies from the jar. Emily, he said, his tone firmer now, the mechanic's precision in his voice. This isn't just a mix-up. My name's on this loan, my social security number, my date of birth. If you know something, you need to tell me. This is serious. Don't get all worked up, she snapped, the cheer vanishing from her voice like a light flicked off. I'm in the middle of dinner with the kids, okay? Lily's got a science project due and Max is driving me nuts. Can we talk later? Before he could say another word, the line went dead. John stared at the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears, a dull roar that drowned out the hum of the refrigerator. That wasn't the Emily he knew, the one who'd cried on his shoulder when their dad died of a heart attack at 58, the one who'd baked him a lopsided chocolate cake for his 40th birthday, grinning as she smeared icing on his nose and teased him about getting old. This was someone dodging, hiding, someone who sounded cornered. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, the letter glaring at him from the table like an accusation he couldn't shake. His mind rewound to last summer, a sticky July afternoon when Emily had shown up at his apartment, all smiles and apologies for not visiting sooner. She'd sat at this same table, sipping iced tea he'd poured from a pitcher, and said she needed his social security number for some paperwork tied to their late mother's estate. It's just a formality, she'd said, her eyes bright and earnest, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she talked about settling an old account their mom had left behind. You know how Mom was. Always leaving loose ends, she'd added with a laugh. John hadn't questioned it. She was his sister. He trusted her. Now, that trust felt like a crack in the foundation of their relationship, one that was spreading with every second he stared at that letter. He thought back further, to their childhood, in that cramped East Side house, a place that always smelled faintly of their mother's lavender hand cream and their father's cigarette smoke. Their parents had worked long hours, Dad at a factory that made car parts, Mom as a nurse at Riverside Hospital, coming home with tired eyes but a smile for her kids. Money was tight, but they had each other. John remembered Emily sneaking him cookies when he was grounded for skipping chores, the two of them giggling under the covers with a flashlight, reading Spider-Man comics past bedtime. He'd fixed her bike when the chain broke, taught her how to throw a punch when the neighbor kid bullied her, stood up for her when their dad got mad about her skipping school. They'd been a team, two kids against the world. Even after their parents passed, Dad too young, Mom to cancer 3 years later at 60, they'd leaned on each other through the grief, the funerals, the endless paperwork of settling estates and clearing out their childhood home. They'd sat together in that house one last time, splitting a pizza and laughing through tears about their dad's terrible jokes and their mom's obsession with gardening. Could that same Emily have done this? Taken his identity, his trust, and turned it into a $25,000 noose around his neck? John stood and paced the small kitchen, his work boots heavy on the linoleum floor. He stopped at the window, looking out at the street below, where a couple walked their dog under the glow of a street lamp. His life had been simple, predictable: work, home, maybe a beer with friends at the corner bar on Fridays. He liked it that way. He'd never wanted much, just enough to get by, and maybe, someday, that cabin where he could sit on a porch and listen to the crickets. Now, that dream felt like it was slipping through his fingers, replaced by a nightmare he hadn't asked for. He thought about his job at Harper's, where he'd worked for 15 years, starting as an apprentice and earning his place as the guy everyone trusted to fix the tough jobs. His boss, Tom Harper, was a gruff man in his 60s who valued hard work and loyalty. What would Tom think if he found out John was tangled in a mess like this? Would he believe John was innocent? Or would he wonder if John had been reckless, foolish? The next morning, John drove to the First National Bank on High Street. The building was a squat, red brick structure with large windows and a faded sign promising friendly service since 1952. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee and printer ink, the kind of place that felt frozen in time, with faded carpet and a clock that ticked too loudly. A young teller named Sarah greeted him with a practiced smile, her name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I got this letter," John said, sliding it across the counter, his voice steady but tight, like a wrench turned just shy of stripping the bolt. "Says I owe money on a loan I didn't take out. I need to get this sorted." Sarah typed something into her computer, her smile fading as she scanned the screen, her eyes flicking between the monitor and John. "Mr. Carter, it looks like the loan was opened in your name 6 months ago. There's a balance of $25,000, and you've missed 3 payments, so late fees are adding up. About $750 so far." "I didn't open any loan," John said, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I've never even been inside this bank before today." Sarah's brow furrowed as she clicked through more screens, her fingers moving quickly, the keyboard clacking softly. "The account was opened online, using your social security number, date of birth, and other personal details. Address, phone number, even your mother's maiden name. Everything matches your profile exactly. Do you have any idea how someone might have accessed that information?" John's stomach sank, a cold weight settling in his chest. Emily's face flashed in his mind, her nervous laugh, her quick hang-up, that July afternoon when she'd asked for his social security number with that earnest smile. He didn't say her name, not yet, but the suspicion was a heavy load, pressing harder with every breath. "What happens if I don't pay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost resigned, like a man staring down a storm he couldn't outrun. Sarah's expression softened, but her words were firm, clinical. "The bank can pursue legal action, garnish your wages, or seize assets, like your car, your savings, even your tools if they're valuable. I'd recommend filing a police report for identity theft and contacting our fraud department immediately. I can give you the forms to start the process, and here's the number for our fraud team. They're open until 6 p.m. John left the bank with a stack of paperwork and a phone number scribbled on a post-it note. He sat in his old Ford pickup in the parking lot, staring at the steering wheel, the forms crumpled in his lap. Identity theft. The phrase felt like something from a crime show, not his life. He'd worked hard to build a simple, honest existence. Long hours at the shop, saving for that cabin, maybe a place where he could sit on a porch and watch the stars without the city's glow drowning them out. Now that dream felt like it was being stolen, replaced by a nightmare he hadn't asked for. He thought about his co-workers at Harper's, guys like Eddie, who always had a story about his kids, or Maria, who ran the front desk and brought homemade tamales on Fridays. What would they think if they knew? Would they look at him differently, whisper behind his back? That evening, John drove to his friend Mike's house on the west side of town. Mike, 55, was a retired cop who now ran a small security business out of his garage, installing alarms for local shops and restaurants. They'd been friends since high school, when they'd bonded over rebuilding a junkyard Chevy and sneaking beers behind the bleachers at football games. Mike's living room was cluttered with old case files, fishing rods, and a coffee table scarred with beer bottle rings, but it felt like a safe haven, a place where John could breathe. Over a couple of cold ones, John poured out the whole story, the letter, The bank, Emily's dodge, the sinking feeling that his sister might be behind it all. Mike listened, his face growing darker with every word, his thick fingers wrapped around his beer bottle like he was holding back a punch. "John, this smells like family trouble," he said, leaning forward, his voice low and blunt, the way he used to talk when he was breaking up bar fights on the beat. "You gave her your social security number, and now there's a loan in your name. That's not a coincidence. You need to confront her, and you need to do it soon. No sugarcoating it." "I don't want to believe it's her," John said, his voice wavering, the beer bottle cold against his palm, his eyes fixed on a crack in the coffee table. "She's my sister, Mike. We've been through everything together. Losing mom and dad, cleaning out their house, all of it. She wouldn't do this." Mike shook his head, his eyes steady and unyielding, the cop in him still sharp. "Family can hurt you worse than anyone, John. I saw it all the time on the force. Siblings, parents, you name it. People get desperate, make bad choices, think they'll fix it before anyone notices. If she did this, the longer you wait, the harder it'll be to fix. Get her to talk, and don't let her wiggle out of it." John nodded, but the idea of confronting Emily felt like a knife twisting in his gut, a pain that radiated through his chest. They'd lost so much already. Parents, stability, the ease of their childhood bond. He thought about the last time he'd seen Emily's kids, at Lily's 9th birthday party last spring. Lily had hugged him, her face sticky with cake frosting, and Max had shown him a toy car he'd fixed with tape. Could Emily have done this, knowing it could ruin him? He drove home that night, the letter still on his kitchen table, its words a shadow cast over everything he thought he knew about his sister. A warning he couldn't ignore. John woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest that felt like a stone lodged between his ribs. The letter from First National Bank still lay on his kitchen table, its edges curling slightly, like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. His small apartment in Columbus, Ohio felt claustrophobic, the walls pressing in as the reality of his situation sank deeper. He brewed a pot of coffee, the bitter scent filling the air, and sat down with the stack of fraud forms from the bank. The paperwork was a maze of legal jargon, terms like affidavit of fraud, creditor liability, and dispute resolution process that made his head pound. John wasn't a man who dealt with forms or fine print. He fixed things with his hands, coaxing life back into broken engines at Harper's Auto Shop. But this wasn't a car he could wrench back into shape. This was a $25,000 loan in his name, a debt he didn't take, and a growing suspicion that his sister Emily was behind it. He spent the morning hunched over the table, filling out the forms as best he could. His handwriting was uneven, the pen digging into the paper from frustration. He listed his personal details, name, address, social security number, checked boxes about unauthorized accounts, and wrote a brief statement. "I did not apply for or receive any funds from this loan." It felt inadequate, like trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape. John kept replaying his conversation with Emily from 2 days ago. Her brittle laugh, her quick hang-up, the way she dodged his questions like a kid caught sneaking candy. He wanted to believe there was another explanation, a glitch, a stranger who'd stolen his identity. But Mike's words from their talk at his house echoed in his mind. Family can hurt you worse than anyone. John pushed the forms aside and grabbed his phone, staring at Emily's contact, her name glowing on the screen. He needed answers, not more paperwork, and he wasn't going to get them over the phone. By noon, John was in his old Ford pickup, driving across town to Emily's house in Worthington. The neighborhood was a picture of suburban calm, with neat lawns, American flags fluttering on porches, and kids riding bikes in the afternoon sun. Emily's house stood out, with its bright red door and a basketball hoop over the garage, where her son Max often shot hoops after school. John parked on the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he gathered his nerve. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't want to give Emily another chance to dodge him, to hide behind excuses about dinner or the kids. He needed to see her face, to look into her eyes and find the truth. He knocked on the red door, the sound sharp in the still afternoon. After a moment, Emily opened it, her smile faltering when she saw him standing there, his work boots scuffed and his jacket rumpled from the drive. She wore a gray sweater and jeans, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, but her eyes were wary, like she'd been expecting trouble and hoped it wouldn't come. "John? What are you doing here?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder into the house, where the faint sound of a TV drifted out. "We need to talk," John said, his voice low but firm, the same tone he used when a customer at the shop tried to haggle over a fair price. "Now." Emily hesitated, her hand lingering on the doorframe, then stepped aside. "Fine. But the kids are home, so keep it quick. Greg's at work, and I've got a million things to do. Laundry, dinner, Lily's science project." John followed her into the living room, where toys were scattered on the carpet, and a TV played a cartoon about talking dogs. Lily, Emily's 10-year-old daughter, was sprawled on the couch, scrolling on a tablet, her headphones half on. Max, 7, sat cross-legged on the floor, building a wobbly Lego tower that looked ready to topple. "Hey, Uncle John," Max said, grinning, his front tooth missing. John managed a tight smile, but his chest ached. These were his niece and nephew, kids he'd bounced on his knee, taken to the zoo, bought ice cream for on hot summer days. He felt out of place now, like an intruder in his sister's perfect life, a life that might be built on a lie. Emily led him to the kitchen, where sunlight streamed through a window above the sink, glinting off a row of clean dishes. She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter, her posture defensive. "So, what's this about? Still freaking out about that bank letter?" "It's not just a letter, Em," John said, pulling a folded copy of it from his jacket pocket and setting it on the counter between them. "It's a loan in my name, 25 grand, with my social security number, my address, everything. I didn't take it, but you asked for my social last summer. You said it was for Mom's estate, some old account. What's going on?" Emily's face tightened, her eyes flicking to the letter before meeting his, a flash of something, fear, maybe anger, crossing her features. "I told you I don't know anything about it," she said, her voice sharp. "Why are you accusing me? I'm your sister, John. I wouldn't do that to you. I can't believe you'd even think that." "Then explain why you needed my social," John said, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. "You gave me some vague story about Mom's estate, but you never showed me any paperwork, never told me what it was for. Now there's a loan in my name, and you're acting like you're hiding something." Emily's cheeks flushed, and she glanced toward the living room, lowering her voice to a hiss. "Keep it down, okay? The kids are right there. Look, I did use your social for some paperwork, but it was nothing shady. Mom had an old account with some debts tied to it, and I was trying to clear it up so it wouldn't come back to haunt us. I didn't take out any loan, John. You're blowing this out of proportion." John stared at her, searching her face for the sister he thought he knew. Her story didn't add up, the pieces misaligned like a badly tuned engine. "What kind of debts?" he pressed. "Why didn't you tell me the details? And why's the bank saying I owe them money now? They've got my info, Em, and you're the only one I gave it to." Emily sighed, rubbing her temples like she was warding off a headache. "It's complicated, okay? I didn't want to stress you out. You're always so busy at the shop, working those long hours, and I thought I could handle it. Maybe someone got your info from that paperwork. Identity theft happens all the time. Hackers, scammers, whatever. John's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. Identity theft doesn't just happen, Em. Someone had my social, my date of birth, my address, my mother's maiden name, everything. And you're the only one I gave that to. If you're telling the truth, show me the paperwork you filed. Let's go to the bank together and clear this up. Emily froze, her mouth opening, then closing, like a fish gasping for air. I can't just drop everything, she said finally, her voice tight. I've got the kids, and Greg's out of town for work. Can't you handle it? File a report or whatever the bank told you to do. John's heart sank, a cold weight settling deeper in his chest. Her excuses, her deflections. It was the same dodge from their phone call, the same nervous energy. Emily, he said quietly, his voice heavy with hurt, if you did this, just tell me. We can figure it out together. But if you keep lying, it's gonna get worse. For both of us. I'm not lying, she snapped, loud enough that Lily looked up from the couch, pulling off her headphones. Emily lowered her voice, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears or just anger. Get out, John. I can't deal with this right now. You're acting like I'm some criminal. John stood there, the air thick with tension, the red door behind him feeling like a wall between the past they'd shared and the present tearing them apart. He wanted to believe her tears, her indignation, but the cracks in her story were too wide to ignore. He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him, the sound final, like a lock turning. He drove back to his apartment, his mind a tangle of anger, doubt, and a deep, aching sadness. Emily's tears had looked real, but so had her lies. Was she desperate, or was she playing him? He didn't know anymore. He thought about their childhood, the way they'd clung to each other after their parents died. First their dad, to a heart attack, then their mom, to cancer. They'd sorted through their parents' belongings together, laughing and crying over old photos, their dad's fishing hat, their mom's recipe cards. Could that Emily, his partner through grief, have betrayed him like this? That afternoon, John went to the police station to file a report. The precinct was a gray concrete building with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint smell of burnt coffee. An officer named Daniels, a middle-aged man with a tired face and a buzz cut, took his statement at a desk cluttered with papers and a half-eaten donut. John explained the loan, the letter, and his suspicions about Emily, though saying it out loud felt like a betrayal of its own. He handed over the bank letter and the fraud forms, his hands steady but his voice tight. Daniels jotted notes, his pen scratching against the paper, his expression unreadable. Identity theft's tough to prove, especially with family, he said, leaning back in his chair. If your sister used your info, we'd need evidence, bank records, IP addresses from the online application, maybe transaction logs. Filing this report starts the process, but it could take months to investigate. In the meantime, freeze your credit with the bureaus. Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. That stops anyone from opening more accounts in your name. You got a lawyer? No, John said, his stomach twisting. Can't afford one. Daniels nodded, like he'd heard that before. Legal aid might help. There's a clinic downtown that takes cases like this. I'll give you their card. John left the station with a case number, a pamphlet on identity theft, and a business card for the legal aid clinic. The advice felt like a Band-Aid on a broken bone, well-meaning, but not enough. Back at his apartment, he called the bank's fraud department, spending an hour on hold, the muzak grating on his nerves. When he finally reached a woman named Karen, her voice was flat, like she was reading from a script. "We've noted your claim, Mr. Carter," Karen said. "You'll need to submit the fraud affidavit, a copy of the police report, and proof of identity, driver's license, passport, that sort of thing. We'll investigate, but it can take 60 to 90 days. Until then, the account remains active, and payments are due to avoid collections." "You're saying I have to pay for a loan I didn't take?" John asked, his voice rising, incredulous. You can dispute the charges, Karen said, her tone unchanged. But non-payment could affect your credit score and lead to further action, like wage garnishment. John hung up, his head pounding, his hands shaking as he set the phone down. His credit score, his savings, his future. Everything was at risk because of a loan he didn't take. He thought about Emily's house, her kids, her life that looked so perfect from the outside. Had she been desperate enough to do this? He remembered a conversation from last Christmas at a family dinner at her place. Emily had mentioned Greg's company downsizing, how he was working longer hours to prove his worth. She'd laughed it off, pouring wine and saying they'd be fine. But there'd been a tightness in her voice, a flicker of worry in her eyes. Was that the start of it? Had she taken the loan to keep up appearances? To pay for the kids' school, the mortgage, the life she'd built? The next day, John went to work at Harper's auto shop, hoping the familiar rhythm of the garage would clear his head. The shop was a cavernous space filled with the clang of tools, the hum of a hydraulic lift, and the sharp smell of oil and metal. John focused on a Chevy with a bad transmission, his hands moving with the precision of 15 years of practice. But his mind kept drifting to Emily, the bank, the police report. His coworker, Eddie, a wiry man in his 50s, with a penchant for bad puns, noticed his distraction while they worked side by side. "You okay, man?" Eddie asked, wiping his hands on a rag, his brow furrowed. Been quiet all day, and you just put a socket wrench in the wrong tray." John hesitated, then told him the basics: the loan, the bank, his suspicions about Emily. He left out the details of their fight, but the weight of it spilled into his words. Eddie whistled low, leaning against the Chevy. "That's rough, man. My cousin had his identity stolen a few years back. Some hacker got his info, ran up 10 grand in charges. Took him years to fix. But if it's your sister, that's a whole other mess. You talked to her yet?" "Tried," John said, tightening a bolt with more force than necessary. "Went to her house yesterday. She's dodging me, saying it's a misunderstanding, but it doesn't add up." Eddie shook his head, his rag dangling from his hand. "Family's tricky, John. You gotta push, though. Get the truth, or it'll eat you up. My sister borrowed money from me once, swore she'd pay it back, then ghosted me for a year. Had to track her down. Hurt like hell, but we worked it out." John nodded, but the weight of it all felt heavier than ever, like a car he couldn't lift off its jack. He thought about his boss, Tom Harper, a gruff man in his 60s who'd given John a chance as an apprentice when he was just a kid with no experience. What would Tom think if he knew about this mess? Would he question John's reliability, his judgment? John couldn't afford to lose this job. Not now, not with a $25,000 shadow hanging over him. That evening, John called Mike again, needing his friend's blunt perspective to cut through the fog in his head. They met at Rusty's, a dive bar on the edge of town where the jukebox played old country tunes and the air smelled of fried onions and stale beer. The bar was half empty. A few regulars nursing drinks at the counter, their faces lit by the neon glow of a Budweiser sign. John and Mike sat in a corner booth, the vinyl seats cracked and sticky. Over a couple of cold ones, John recounted his visit to Emily's, the tense exchange in her kitchen, the police station, the bank's unhelpful response. Mike listened, his face growing darker with every word, his thick fingers wrapped around his beer bottle like he was holding back a storm. "She's stalling, John," he said, leaning forward, his voice low and blunt, the way he used to talk when he was breaking up bar fights on the beat. "That's what people do when they're guilty. Deflect, make excuses, turn it back on you. That business about Mom's debts sounds like a story she made up on the spot. You need to dig deeper. Check her finances, her lifestyle. Something's off." "How do I do that?" John asked, his voice heavy, his eyes fixed on the condensation running down his bottle. "I'm not a cop, Mike. I don't know how to investigate my own sister." "Start with what you know," Mike said, his tone firm but not unkind. She mentioned Greg's job being shaky? Look into that. Ask around, neighbors, friends, maybe even her kid's school. See if she's been spending money she shouldn't have, like new cars, vacations, anything that doesn't add up. And don't let her guilt trip you. If she did this, she's the one who broke trust, not you. John nodded, but the idea of spying on Emily felt like another betrayal, a step further from the kids they'd been. Sneaking cookies and laughing under the covers. He thought about Lily and Max, their innocent smiles, the way they called him Uncle John with such trust. If Emily had done this, what would it do to them? To their family? He drove home that night, the letter still on his kitchen table, its words a constant reminder of the mess he was in. He sat in the dark, the glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds, and wondered how it had come to this. How his sister, his last piece of family, could be the one tearing his life apart. John Carter sat at his kitchen table. The letter from First National Bank, now creased and worn from being handled too many times, its edges frayed like his nerves. It was Saturday morning, 2 days after his tense confrontation with Emily in her Worthington kitchen, and the weight of her words, or the lack of them, hung over him like a storm cloud ready to break. Her denials, her quick deflection to the kids, her tears that seemed both real and rehearsed, hadn't eased his suspicions. If anything, they deepened them, seeping into the cracks of his trust like oil into a cracked engine block. Mike's advice, to dig deeper, echoed in his mind, but the thought of investigating his own sister felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been to each other. Kids who'd shared secrets by the creek, who'd leaned on each other when their parents died. Still, John couldn't let it go. The $25,000 loan was a noose tightening around his neck, threatening his job at Harper's Auto Shop, his meager savings, his dream of a quiet cabin in the Hocking Hills where he could fish and forget the world. He needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. He started with what he knew, piecing together the fragments Emily had let slip. Last Christmas, over a dinner of ham and mashed potatoes at her house, she'd mentioned Greg's job being shaky, her voice tight, despite the wine she kept pouring. At the time, John had thought it was just stress, the kind every family goes through. But now, that detail felt like a loose thread he could pull. Greg worked as a mid-level manager at Midwest Assurance, an insurance firm downtown. John didn't know much about that world. Suits and spreadsheets were a far cry from the grease and wrenches of his life. But he remembered Emily's forced smile when she'd said, "We'll be fine," as if she was convincing herself. Had they been struggling? Was that why she'd needed money? John grabbed his laptop, an old Dell that groaned as it booted up, and started searching online. He typed, "Midwest Assurance layoffs," into Google, his fingers clumsy on the keys. A few articles popped up, one from last fall, mentioning the company cutting 10% of its staff due to market pressures. Another article, buried deeper, noted that middle managers were among the hardest hit. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to make John wonder what else Emily hadn't told him. Mike's suggestion to check her lifestyle for signs of overspending gnawed at him. Emily's house in Worthington was nice. Nicer than John's one-bedroom apartment with its peeling paint and noisy pipes. But it wasn't a mansion. Still, there were things that didn't add up. Last summer, before the loan appeared, Emily had posted photos on Facebook of a family trip to Disney World. John had scrolled past them, smiling at pictures of Lily and Max, grinning in front of Cinderella's castle, their faces painted with Mickey Mouse ears. He'd liked the post, happy for his niece and nephew. But now he wondered how they'd afforded it. Private school for the kids wasn't cheap. Emily had bragged about the Academy's science program for Lily and soccer team for Max. Then there were the extras. Piano lessons for Lily, a fancy summer camp for Max, new clothes that looked more expensive than what John remembered from their childhood. Had Emily taken the loan to keep up that life? To maintain the polished image of a perfect suburban family? John drove to Worthington that afternoon, not to confront Emily, but to talk to someone who might know more, Mrs. Larson, their neighbor. Mrs. Larson was a retired teacher in her 60s, the kind of woman who noticed everything but kept her judgments to herself, unless asked. John had met her at Lily's 9th birthday party last spring, where she'd cooed over the kids and brought a homemade lemon cake. He found her in her front yard, pruning roses in a wide-brimmed hat, her hands steady despite her age. "John, good to see you," Mrs. Larson said, setting down her shears and wiping her brow. "What brings you by? Visiting Emily and the kids?" "Just in the neighborhood," John said, forcing a smile that felt stiff on his face. "Actually, I wanted to ask about her and Greg. They doing okay? I know things have been tough with Greg's job." Mrs. Larson's smile faded slightly, her eyes sharpening, as if she sensed the weight behind his question. "They're managing, I suppose," she said carefully. "Emily's always so cheerful, keeping that house spotless, but I've noticed she's been stressed. Last fall she mentioned Greg's company was letting people go, said it was just rumors, but you could see it worried her. And they got that new SUV a few months back, nice, shiny thing, leather seats and all. I wondered how they swung it with all the uncertainty." John's stomach twisted, a cold knot forming. A new SUV? Emily hadn't mentioned that, not once. "They seem to be spending a lot," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Disney trips, private school, new car. You think they're stretched thin?" Mrs. Larson hesitated, her hands fussing with a rose stem. "I don't pry, dear, but Emily did ask to borrow $100 last month for Max's soccer fees. Said their account was tied up for a few days. I didn't think much of it. She paid me back the next week. But it did strike me as odd for them. They've always seemed comfortable, you know?" John thanked her and left, his mind racing as he walked back to his truck. A new SUV, a Disney trip, private school, borrowing small cash from neighbors. None of it screamed desperation, but it didn't scream stability either. It was the kind of spending you did when you were trying to keep up appearances, to hide cracks in the foundation. He drove to a coffee shop in Worthington, a quiet place with wooden tables and the smell of roasted beans, needing somewhere to think. Sitting in a corner booth with a black coffee, he called the legal aid clinic Officer Daniels had recommended. A woman named Rachel, who sounded young but sharp, answered and listened as John explained the situation. The loan, Emily's evasiveness, the police report, the new details about her spending. "You're in a tough spot, Mr. Carter," Rachel said, her voice calm but direct. "Family cases are messy because trust is involved. The police report and fraud affidavit are a good start, but you'll need evidence tying your sister to the loan. If it was opened online, the bank might have IP logs, email records, or even device IDs from the application. You could also check your credit report for other accounts you didn't open. If she used your info once, she might have done it again." John's throat tightened at the thought, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "How do I get those logs?" "You'll need to file a formal request with the bank's fraud department," Rachel said. "It's slow, could take weeks, but they're required to provide them under federal law, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Also, consider a private investigator if you can afford one. They can dig into her financials, legally, of course, looking for patterns, like new accounts or unusual transactions." John couldn't afford a private investigator, not with his savings already stretched thin from bills and now this mess. He thanked Rachel and hung up, staring at the coffee shop's brick wall where a chalkboard listed daily specials. The idea of hiring someone to spy on his sister felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross, like admitting their bond was already broken. But so did the idea of losing everything, his job, his truck, his dream of that cabin, because of her. That evening, John went back to Rusty's, the dive bar where he and Mike had talked before. The place was busier tonight, the jukebox playing Johnny Cash while regulars laughed at the counter, their voices mingling with the clink of glasses. Mike was already there, nursing a beer and watching a baseball game on the TV above the bar, the Reds losing as usual. John slid into the booth, his shoulders slumped, and told Mike about his day. The Google search about Greg's company, Mrs. Larson's comments about the SUV and borrowed money, the call to the legal aid clinic. Mike listened, his jaw tight, his thick fingers tapping the beer bottle. "Sounds like she's living beyond her means," he said, leaning forward, his voice low and blunt, the way he used to talk when he was a cop breaking up bar fights. Disney trips, new cars, private school. That's not cheap, John. If Greg's job's gone or shaky, where's the money coming from? You gotta confront her again, but this time, don't let her whittle out. Lay out what you know. Her story about Mom's estate, the SUV, the trip, the neighbor's loan. See how she reacts. John nodded, but the thought of another fight with Emily made his chest ache, a dull pain that hadn't let up since this started. What if she's telling the truth? What if it's not her? Then she'll help you fix it, Mike said, his eyes steady, unyielding. She'll go to the bank with you, show you the paperwork she claims she filed. But if she's lying, you'll see it in her face. You know her better than anyone, John. Trust your gut. The next day, John called Emily and asked to meet somewhere neutral, away from her house and the kids. He suggested a park near her neighborhood, a quiet place with picnic tables and a playground where they'd taken Lily and Max to play years ago. Emily agreed, her voice wary but not refusing. They met on a Sunday afternoon, the park nearly empty except for a few families and a jogger with a dog. Emily sat on a bench, her arms crossed, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. John stood in front of her, the fraud forms and bank letter in a folder under his arm, his work boots scuffing the gravel. "I talked to Mrs. Larson," John said, diving in without preamble. "She mentioned the new SUV, the Disney trip, how you borrowed $100 for Max's soccer fees. You told me Greg's job was fine, but I looked it up. His company laid off a bunch of people last fall. You're spending like everything's okay, Em, but it's not, is it?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her sunglasses hiding her eyes but not the tension in her jaw. "You're spying on me now? Talking to my neighbors? That's low, John, even for you." "I'm trying to save my life," John said, his voice rising, the words spilling out faster than he meant. "This loan's ruining me. The bank's threatening to garnish my wages, take my truck, maybe even my tools. I talked to a legal aid lawyer. They said the bank can trace the loan's IP address. If it leads to you, Em, what am I supposed to do?" Emily's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was sharp. "I told you I didn't take any loan. I used your social for Mom's estate. That's it. Maybe someone hacked me, got your info that way. Why are you doing this to me? I'm your sister." John pulled out the bank letter and held it up, his hand steady despite the storm inside him. "Because this has my name on it. Not yours. I'm the one who can't sleep, who's got collectors calling my phone. If you're innocent, come with me to the bank tomorrow. Help me trace this. Show me the paperwork you filed for Mom's estate. Prove it wasn't you." Emily stood, her voice shaking, her sunglasses still hiding her eyes. "I can't keep doing this, John. I've got my own problems. Greg's job, the kids, the house. We're barely holding on. I didn't do this, but I can't fix it for you either." She turned and walked away, her steps quick, leaving John standing alone by the bench, the folder heavy in his hands, the autumn leaves crunching under his boots. Days turned into weeks, and the bank's investigation crawled along, each update slower than the last. John followed Officer Daniel's advice and froze his credit with Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, a process that took hours of navigating automated phone systems. He checked his credit report online, his heart pounding as he scanned for other unauthorized accounts. There were none, yet. But the loan was there, a red stain on his otherwise clean record, dragging his credit score down to a number that made him wince. The bank sent a letter saying they'd trace the loan's IP address to a public Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop in Worthington, one John knew Emily frequented for her morning lattes. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was close, a thread that kept pulling him back to her. John confronted Emily one last time, showing up at her house unannounced on a chilly evening. Greg was home this time, watching TV in the living room, but Emily met John at the door, her face pale. He showed her the bank's letter about the IP address, his voice low but firm. "This came from your coffee shop, Em, the one you go to every week. Tell me the truth. Please." Emily's face crumpled, and she broke down, sobbing, her hands covering her face. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice barely audible. "We were drowning, John. Greg got laid off last year, and the bills kept coming, mortgage, school, the car. I took the loan in your name, thinking I could pay it back before you noticed. Greg got a new job, but it's not enough, and the payments snowballed. I'm so sorry." John felt like the ground had dropped out from under him, his legs unsteady. His sister, his last piece of family, had betrayed him. He wanted to yell, to demand why she hadn't asked for help, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there, the letter trembling in his hand, as Emily cried. Greg appeared in the doorway, his face confused, but John didn't stay to explain. He walked away, the red door closing behind him, the sound echoing like a final goodbye. The bank eventually closed the loan as fraudulent after John submitted the police report and Emily's tearful admission recorded on his phone during that last confrontation. But the damage was done. His credit score was scarred, his savings drained from legal fees and missed work. He kept fixing cars at Harper's, his hands steady even when his heart wasn't, saving again for that cabin in the Hocking Hills. But the dream felt hollow now, tainted by the loss of something more precious than money. He and Emily barely spoke after that, their calls limited to stilted check-ins about the kids. Lily and Max still hugged him at family gatherings, oblivious to the rift, but John felt the distance every time he saw them. He'd lost the sister he thought he knew, the one he'd trusted with his secrets, his grief, his life. And no amount of time, no cabin in the woods, could fix that fracture.